I ended the last section of the lecture by mentioning that, in addition to biological theories about the causes of mental disorders, in the 19th century we also see the creation of psychological or interpersonal theories. The first of these theories was based on the work of Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud, who established the psychoanalytic method, and that's what I'm going to talk you through in this lecture. Now, if you're already familiar with these ideas, that's great. This will serve as a refresher for you. But if they're brand new to you, that's okay. In psychology, we often talk about four forces or dominating theories in the field. Psychoanalytic was the first of these forces because, for the first time, it acknowledged that symptoms of mental illnesses may be caused by internal psychological phenomena that people are not necessarily aware of. We can think of psychoanalytic theory as introducing three different principles: the unconscious, the structure of personality, and psychosexual development. Now, before we get started, I want to provide a little bit of a caveat. Many people, when they first learn about Freud and the underlying principles of psychoanalysis, often have a negative reaction to his ideas. Quite frankly, they presume he's a quack or completely off his rocker. What I'm hoping is that you'll suspend that judgment and recognize that even if the ideas seem unconventional or difficult to digest, they were a product of their time and have actually served as the foundation for a lot of what we know to be true today in terms of psychology. So be easy on Freud. Give him a chance. Stay open-minded. So let's start by talking about the unconscious. The notion of the unconscious is often said to be Freud's greatest contribution to the field of psychology, in part because prior to Freud's naming of the unconscious, no one really had a language to talk about what went on inside our minds. By naming the unconscious, which Freud defined as the part of the mind of which we are unaware, he gave us a new way to conceptualize human experience and thought, by recognizing that what we're aware of represents only a tiny, tiny portion of what actually exists in the mind. What Freud said was that the unconscious consists of the instinctual representatives which seek to discharge their cathexis, and that's a whole lot of jargon, which essentially means that what populates our unconscious mind are the unacknowledged impulses or experiences or memories, all of which are constantly pushing to be acknowledged. And what Freud said was that ideas remain in the unconscious due to some judgment that if those impulses, experiences, or memories were made available to the conscious mind, they would cause psychic harm. So here's the idea. Let's say this is your brain. Freud believed that all ideas began in the unconscious, both the wicked ones and the very safe ones. Now, whether an idea remains in the unconscious or is allowed to enter into the conscious mind is determined by a type of testing or censorship. The testing serves the purpose of protecting the individual from psychically straining ideas. Now, if upon testing the idea is deemed appropriate for conscious awareness, the idea will be passed into the conscious mind. However, if upon testing the idea is rejected by the censorship, it will be repressed or held in the unconscious. And repression is the process by which the devil thought, right, the insidious thought, that's unacceptable, gets relegated back to the land of the unconscious. So Freud said that we have learned from psychoanalysis that the essence of the process of repression lies not in putting an end to, in annihilating the idea which represents an instinct, but in preventing it from becoming conscious. So what Freud was saying here is that he essentially believed that we did very little forgetting. So if we have a thought that we don't want to have, it doesn't disappear from our minds. It's merely hidden or tucked away from our minds. And for those of you who've seen the Book of Mormon, the song Turn It Off should come to mind when we're talking about this, because that whole song is about repression, about pushing down those thoughts or feelings that are unacceptable or threatening. And repression is one of the fundamental defense mechanisms that Freud proposed, but it's not the only one. In fact, Freud believed that we've developed a whole slew of defense mechanisms, the purpose of which is to protect our conscious mind from threatening or psychically harmful thoughts. So when we have such a thought or feeling, we engage a defense mechanism to relegate that thought or feeling into the unconscious. And this is something we'll spend some class time talking about on Wednesday. The next principle that Freud talked about was the structure of the personality. And Freud proposed that personality is comprised of three different parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. First is the id. And what Freud theorized was that the id is the most primitive component of our personality. It's present at birth, largely unconscious, and ruled by the pleasure principle, or the libidinal drive. And what that means is that the id is always motivated to reduce pain and gain pleasure, regardless of the consequences. Given this ruling drive, the id is often considered to be illogical or immoral, because again, the motivating force for the id is not what's right, but what feels good. Next is the superego. And we can think of the superego as being the kind of polar opposite of the id. It serves as the internal representation of parental or social learning, and as such is driven by making decisions based on what is good or bad rather than what is pleasurable or desired. We can think of the superego as being perfectionistic. And the process through which the superego ends up affecting behavior is by determining how a person feels about himself or herself. If a behavior is deemed good, the person will feel pride or self-love. On the other hand, if a behavior is deemed bad, the person will feel guilt or inferiority. Finally is the ego, which acts as the mediator between the id and the superego. Freud theorized that the ego is ruled by the reality principle. So the ego is rational and always planful, attempting to balance the desires of the id with the rules of the superego. In this role, the ego ends up being responsible for what's allowed to enter the conscious mind. So we can think about the ego as the connection between the internal and external worlds, rationally controlling the id in order to make life orderly, productive, and in harmony with the actual world, while also controlling the more stifling demands made by the superego. This idea of balance between good and evil, or between socially acceptable versus instinctual drives, is seen throughout society. So we often see representations of the id as the devil and the superego as the angel, with the ego, the champion, in the middle. This balance between our multiple selves is also represented in artwork, as well as in movies. So the psychoanalytic interpretation of The Lord of the Rings hints at the possibility that Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, or Smeagol, are actually a representation of the ego, superego, and id, respectively. The final principle that Freud and psychoanalytic theory is most well known for, which is also possibly the most controversial, is Freud's stages of psychosexual development. Remember, as your textbook said, Freud was all about sex. Essentially, he believed that the libido, which was the sex or life drive, is what governed all of life, and that successful maturation was dependent upon successfully negotiating various stages of psychosexual development. We're not going to spend too much time on this because, frankly, you'll learn about it in a variety of other places, but suffice it to say that Freud's belief about development were that either over or under indulgence in any of these stages will affect later development and personality traits. So Freud said that there are 5 stages through which everyone progresses: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital, and that people progress through these stages throughout childhood, with development being complete by age 18. The first stage is the oral stage, which lasts from birth to around age 1. And what Freud said was that babies explore the world and feel pleasure through their mouths, which is why babies are constantly putting things in their mouths. The primary conflict during this time period is weaning. And what Freud said was that if a child was overindulged during the weaning process, meaning that if the child's nursing urges were always and often excessively satisfied, then the child would end up being not only optimistic, but also possibly gullible and always looking for confirmation from others. If, on the other hand, the child is underindulged during the weaning process, so if the mother refuses to nurse him on demand, or who truncated nursing sessions early, the child would be pessimistic, envious, suspicious, or sarcastic. The next stage is the anal stage. So from about 1 to 3 years of age, libidinal drives are directed towards the anus. It's during this time that toilet training serves as the primary conflict. And this conflict represents a classic conflict between the id, which derives pleasure from expulsion of bodily waste, and the ego and superego, which represent the practical and societal pressures to control the bodily functions. According to Freud, if a child is neither over or underindulged during the toilet training, so if they successfully and non-traumatically become toilet trained, then they'll likely develop a sense of control over themselves and proper attitudes towards authority. If, on the other hand, the child is either over or underindulged, certain characteristics can develop. So, if the child thwarts parent desires and takes pleasure in excreting maliciously, perhaps just before or just after being placed on the toilet, and if the parents are too lenient and the child manages to derive pleasure from this expulsion, it will result in the formation of, and sorry about this term, an anal expulsive character. Yeah. This character is generally messy, disorganized, reckless, careless, and defiant. Conversely, a child may opt to retain feces, thereby defying his parents while enjoying the pleasurable pressure of the built-up feces on his intestines. Yep, still talking about poop here. If this tactic succeeds and the child is overindulged, he'll develop into an anal retentive character. This character is neat, precise, orderly, careful, stingy, withholding, obstinate, meticulous, and sometimes passive-aggressive. Next is the phallic stage. And this is where most people really took issue with what Freud had to say about child development, because it's in this stage when Freud said that children experience either the Oedipus complex for boys or the Electra complex for girls. As Freud said, the phallic stage is marked by the child's unconscious desire to possess the opposite-sexed parent and to eliminate the same-sexed one. Now, just as a preface, this is all extremely heteronormative. Freud seemed to struggle with other perspectives on sexuality, so just a heads up to that. So, in the case of boys, Freud stated that the sexual wishes in regard to the mother become more intense and the father is perceived as an obstacle to her. This gives rise to the Oedipus complex. So in the Oedipus complex, we see the boy desiring his mother, but perceiving the father as standing in the way. As a result, the boy feels aggression or envy towards the father, but also fears that his father will fight back and, in essence, castrate him for his sexual feelings towards his mother. This castration anxiety outstrips his desire for his mother, so he represses the desire and ends up identifying with his father. On the flip side of this is the Electra complex, which is a little bit more vague. According to Freud, in this scenario, the girl realizes that she and other women don't have penises, while also learning that her father does have a penis, which she sexually desires. Similar to the Oedipus complex, this desire leads her initially to reject her mother and align herself with her father, as this drawing shows. However, she soon learns that she can't oust her mother, and so she ends up trying to identify with her mother so that she can possess her father vicariously. According to Freud, fixation at the phallic stage, so failure to successfully resolve the sexual responses to parents, leads to the development of a phallic character, who's reckless, resolute, self-assured, and narcissistic, or excessively vain and proud. Alternately, failure to resolve the conflict can also cause a person to be afraid or incapable of forming close love. And continuing along Freud's problematic perspectives on sexuality, Freud also postulated that fixation could be a root cause of homosexuality. Yeah, he said that. After the phallic stage, we enter the latency period, in which sexual desires and erogenous impulses are repressed so that libidinal energy can be directed to asexual pursuits. It's during this stage, which takes place from the ages of 6 to 12, that children put that energy towards developing friendships and interests. Finally is the genital stage. And Freud said that the less energy the child has left invested in unresolved psychosexual developments, the greater his capacity will be to develop normal relationships with the opposite sex. If, however, he remains fixated, particularly on the phallic stage, his development will be troubled as he struggles with further repression and defenses. Just as an interesting aside, people have very wittily applied Freud's stages of psychosexual development to Miley Cyrus's behavior. I'll let you Google that if you're interested. So if we take this all together, what Freudian psychoanalytic theory suggests is that mental illness occurs as a result of three interlocking issues: psychosexual dilemmas contributed to by conflict between the id, ego, and superego that causes certain material to be kept in the unconscious. As such, traditional psychoanalysis was, and continues to be, typically aimed at addressing symptoms of mental illness by trying to bring unconscious material into the conscious mind. Since Freud first developed his ideas, there have been a whole slew of people called neo-Freudians, like Adler and Jung, who built their own approaches based on their either overlapping or dissenting opinions from Freud. In the final video lecture for this class meeting, I'll give you a brief intro to behavioral theory, and then from there we can talk more about contemporary approaches based on these theories.